Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're doing a deep dive into, well, one of the biggest and maybe most confusing ideas in modern life, democracy.
It really is perplexing, isn't it? Especially in the US. It's this concept that almost everyone says they believe in, that they cherish.
It's foundational to the national identity.
Absolutely. But at the exact same time, there's this incredible skepticism about government. People hate politicians. They don't trust the system. It's almost incoherent.
It is. This paradox is exactly where we need to start. You have this deep public love for the idea of democracy, the principle of it.
But then you have this widespread hatred for the actual practice of government.
And that's the riddle that David Graeber really digs into. The conventional definition we're all taught in school is so thin.
Right. Democracy is just, voting for people every couple years.
But that can't be it. That popular enthusiasm, that feeling that free people should govern their own lives, it has to come from something much, much deeper than just ticking a box.
Something more than just representation.
Exactly. And that's why we're turning to David Graeber's book, The Democracy Project, a history, a crisis, a movement. He just fundamentally rejects that thin definition.
How so?
He treats democracy as a lived practice, a political tradition, not just a legal structure or a constitution on paper. It's an impulse, something people do.
So for this deep dive, we're going to follow his analysis. We're going to look at the systems of governance, the structures of power, especially financial power, that either allow that impulse to flourish or actively suppress it.
Oh, we want to be clear. This isn't about partisan politics. It's not about which party is better. We're looking at the system itself, the deep mechanics of power that shape why the democratic ideal feels so distant from our reality.
Okay, so before we jump into the core ideas, let's get some context on Graeber himself. He was a really unique thinker.
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just a political writer. He was a professional anthropologist and a very respected one. His big famous work was Debt, the first 5,000 years.
So he spent his career studying systems of value exchange and social power. That seems like the perfect background for this kind of analysis.
It gave him a completely different lens. And crucially, he wrote The Democracy Project, not as some detached academic looking down from an ivory tower.
No, he was right in the middle of it.
He was a participant. He was deeply involved in organizing with Occupy Wall Street, or OWS. He was on the ground, in the meetings, part of the process.
I love how he describes his role there. He said he was often a bridge between camps.
It's a great image, isn't it? Because you had all these different groups in Zuccotti Park. You had the hardcore anarchists, the socialists, liberals who were just fed up, people who were just curious.
And he was someone who could, translate between them.
That direct experience is what gives the book its power. And you have to remember, the moment it was written, this was right after the camps were evicted, published in 2013. The 2008 financial crash was still this giant open wound.
And the feeling in the air wasn't just anger, it was powerlessness. A real sense of it.
A profound sense of impotence. Graeber makes a huge point about the political mood in the summer of 2011, right before Occupy kicked off. All the talk in Washington and in the media was about the debt ceiling crisis.
Oh, I remember that. The grand bargain.
The grand bargain, exactly. And what did that mean? It meant a deal to cut Medicare, cut Social Security. The message, relentlessly, was that sacrifices had to be made.
But the sacrifices were only ever demanded from one group of people?
Never from the rich. Never from the banks that actually caused the crisis. The assumption was that average families had to pay the price. The entire political class seemed to be celebrating this idea of making tough choices that only hurt the vulnerable.
It was like the system was openly admitting its purpose, to protect the powerful and make everyone else bear the cost.
And then into that atmosphere of pure cynicism, Occupy happens.
Yeah.
And it just shatters that consensus by showing a different possibility.
It showed people governing themselves right there in a park.
And the reaction from the state tells you everything you need to know. The system's fear of democracy breaking out, as Graeber puts it, was immediate and overwhelming.
He has this one anecdote that just perfectly captures that fear. It's from 2012, after the big camps were already gone.
The one at Federal Hall.
Yes. Tell us about that.
So, a small group of activists, maybe 30 of them, they try to hold a simple speak out, a public reading. And they choose the steps of Federal Hall in New York.
Which is, the symbolism is off the charts. It's the birthplace of the Bill of Rights.
Literally where the Bill of Rights was born. George Washington was inaugurated there. It's federal land. And what happened?
The police show up in force.
Immediately, they bring in these steel barriers, these pens, and they break up the steps into these little enclosed compartments.
The freedom cages.
That's what the activists called them on the spot, freedom cages. And you have this statue of Washington looking down on people being put in cages for trying to speak, right across from the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
The visual is just, it's incredible.
And it wasn't just containment, was it? The police were actively hostile.
Oh, completely. They had a SWAT team there. They arbitrarily limited the number of people who could even be in the cages.
Yeah.
They started making random arrests.
For what?
One person for a noise violation, just for chanting, an Iraq war veteran for using an expletive out of frustration. The message couldn't have been clearer.
That your right to assemble, your right to speak, is conditional.
It's managed. And it can be revoked at any moment. The state decides. So even at this monument to liberty, the real power dynamic was laid bare.
Which brings us to the book's central, and I think for many people, really shocking claim.
It really is a bombshell for how we're taught to think about American history.
Go on.
Graeber argues that the system we call democracy in the United States, this representative Republican form of government, it was explicitly created by the founders to prevent real democracy.
To head it off, to control it.
Exactly. To control the popular, direct, democratic energy that actually fueled the American Revolution. He says the true democratic tradition, that impulse for self-governance, it lives on, but it lives outside of our formal political institutions, always pushing up against them.
Okay, that is a huge claim to unpack. The idea that the U.S. wasn't founded as a democracy, but as a system to contain it. Let's dig into that historical distinction he makes.
You have to. Because the founders, we're talking to Madison, Hamilton, Adams, they didn't use the word democracy as a compliment. For them, it was almost a slur.
It was a scary
A
word.
very scary word. When they heard democracy, they thought of ancient Athens. They thought of demos kratos, the people ruling directly.
So popular assemblies,
No,
citizens gathering and making decisions themselves.
Yes. And to them, that was terrifying. It wasn't some abstract debate for them. It was about protecting their own interests, their own social order.
And most importantly, their property.
That was the absolute core of it. You can read it right there in the Federalist Papers. James Madison is crystal clear. He says that a pure democracy,
A direct democracy.
is a disaster. It leads to, in his words, factionalism, demagoguery, and it's incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. He saw it as pure mob rule.
Now, hold on. The counterargument you always hear is one of practicality. The U.S. was just too big for direct democracy. You couldn't get everyone from Georgia and Massachusetts in the same room.
And that's a fair point about logistics, and they certainly use that as a justification. But Graeber's argument is that the ideology came first. The size of the republic was a feature, not a bug, because it helped them achieve their real goal.
Which was?
Filtering. Madison wrote that the point of a large republic was to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens.
A chosen body, not an average body.
A chosen body whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. And who did he think those wise people were?
Well, people like him, wealthy, educated, property-owning men.
Exactly. So the goal wasn't just better governance, it was safer governance. Safer for the elite. Remember, these guys had seen things like Shays' Rebellion, where indebted farmers rose up against the creditors.
And what was their biggest fear? What did they think these popular assemblies would do?
Two things, specifically. Graeber says their ultimate nightmare was people voting for the abolition of debts and an equal division of property. Those two fears drove the entire design of the Constitution.
So the system was built from the ground up to prevent economic redistribution.
And the mechanism they chose to do this, elections, was seen at the time as an aristocratic method, not a democratic one.
That's going to sound strange to a lot of people. The vote is the sacred heart of our democracy.
But not to the ancient Greeks, not even to someone like Aristotle. He was very clear that elections are aristocratic.
Why?
Because in an election, the people choose from a small number of candidates who present themselves as being better, wiser, more qualified than everyone else. It's literally the rule of the best aristocratia.
And only certain kinds of people can even afford to run for office in the first place. You need money, connections, leisure time.
Of course. Now, contrast that with the truly democratic method, which was used all over the ancient world.
The lottery.
Sortition.
Yeah.
Selection by lottery. You take a pool of all the citizens who are willing to serve, and you draw their names out of a hat, basically.
It's the purest form of political equality. Everyone has the same chance.
And think about what it does. It kills factionalism.
Hmm.
Why would you spend a fortune on a campaign or make corrupt promises if your selection is completely random and you only serve a short term?
Right.
The founders knew all about sortition. They were brilliant students of classical history, and they chose to ignore it completely.
Except for one area.
Juries. They kept it for juries, but they made sure juries could only decide on facts, not on laws or policy. That omission is so telling. It shows the whole point was to limit the role of the people as much as possible, while still giving the illusion of popular consent.
So the word democracy only got attached to the American system much later, when it was politically convenient to rebrand it.
Exactly. They sold the system designed to check popular power as the ultimate expression of it. And that fundamental contradiction, I think, is the source of so much of the political alienation we see today.
That makes perfect sense. And that initial design to protect property and prevent debt abolition, it connects directly to his next major point about how modern financial systems constrain our freedom. He has a specific term for it.
Financialization.
Right. And for Graeber, this isn't some abstract economic term about markets. It's very, very concrete.
It is. He defines it as a kind of systemic collusion. It's the government and the financial industry working together to make sure that more and more people fall deeper and deeper into debt.
It's a policy choice, not just something that happens.
A deliberate policy choice. And he argues that this process has just destroyed the trust people used to have in their institutions. There was this idea of the middle class, this feeling that the system was basically on your side.
That the police, the courts, even the banks were more or less neutral actors.
At least neutral. But that feeling, especially after 2008, has just been obliterated. You have the trauma of the foreclosure crisis, where banks were caught literally faking documents, robo-signing to kick people out of their homes.
And what did the government do?
It bailed out the banks and did almost nothing for the homeowners. So for millions of people, the state was no longer a neutral referee. It was an active enforcer for the financial industry. It was the repo man.
And he gives these really powerful, everyday examples of how this extraction works. It's not just mortgages.
No, it's woven into the fabric of life. Take professional jobs. To be a pharmacist or a nurse now, you often need an advanced degree that costs a fortune.
Which means student loans.
Huge government-backed student loans.
Mhm.
So a huge chunk of your future salary is automatically funneled directly to the banks. Your professional ambition becomes a revenue stream for Wall Street.
He also talks about it at the local level with cities and towns.
Yes, this is fascinating. Local governments get pushed into these terrible deals with financial advisors, they get into debt, and then what happens? They're ordered to raise revenue.
How?
By finding their own citizens.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're cracking down on whether your lawn is mowed or if your trash cans are in the right place. These aren't about community standards anymore.
They're a tax on the poor to pay interest to the rich.
That's exactly what it is. In every single one of these examples, you see wealth being pulled from the bottom and sent to the top, with the government acting as the collection agency.
So when the main job of the federal government seems to be propping up stock prices and making sure no big bank can ever fail.
The line between state power and financial power just dissolves. It becomes, as he says, increasingly unclear.
Which is why the OWS activists came up with that term, mafia capitalism.
It's a provocative term, but it captures that feeling. A system that feels rigged based on loan sharking and systemic corruption, where the government's role is to enforce the racket. And realizing that the system is the problem, not just a few bad politicians, well, that's what made Occupy so potent.
So if the system itself is the problem, the solution can't be to just ask it nicely to change.
Exactly. You can't lobby a corrupt system to be less corrupt. Graeber argues the only path forward is to build a different kind of democratic culture from the ground up.
Which leads us to how OWS actually organized itself, the idea of horizontal direct democracy.
This is where his anarchist background really comes through. He says OWS worked precisely because it wasn't a normal political organization. It was what he calls prefigurative politics.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning you build the new society you want right here, right now, inside the shell of the old one. The way the camps were organized wasn't just a means to an end, it was the end. It was a demonstration.
And the engine of that was the General Assembly and the principle of consensus.
Yes, and consensus is so often misunderstood. People hear it and they think it means everyone have to agree on everything, 100%.
Unanimous voting, which sounds impossible.
And it would be, but that's not what it is. Consensus is a process, not an outcome. It's a way of making decisions where everyone has an equal say, And you keep reworking a proposal until nobody feels like it violates the core principles of the group or that they're being forced into something they hate.
It's about problem solving and not winning a vote.
It's collective problem solving among equals. It prioritizes inclusion over speed. And they had to invent these social technologies to make it work in a huge crowd.
Like the people's mic.
The people's mic, the hand signals.
Yeah.
All of it was designed to facilitate deliberation. You had the twinkling fingers for agreement, the crossed arms for a block. It was a shared language.
And the idea of a block was very serious. It wasn't just that you disagreed.
No, a block was basically a veto. You could only use it if you truly believed the proposal would damage the movement or violated its fundamental ethics. You could also stand aside, which meant, I don't like this, but I won't stop the group from doing it.
So it required a huge amount of good faith and mutual respect.
An incredible amount. It requires you to actively listen to people you disagree with, to try and synthesize their concerns into a better proposal. And Graeber notes that's a skill most of us in modern society have zero training in. We're taught to debate and win, not listen and build.
And he had this great term for the effect this process had on people: contaminationism.
I love that term. The idea is that once you're exposed to this, once you see real deliberative democracy in action, you're contaminated.
It changes your idea of what's possible.
It shatters the cynical belief that humans are all just selfish actors trying to maximize their own gain. It shows that collective intelligence is a real thing. It contaminates you with hope, basically.
So the process itself was the message.
The process was the message. And crucially, he says it only works if you pair it with radical decentralization. You don't bring every little thing to the giant assembly. You empower smaller working groups to make their own decisions. You push power down to the lowest possible level.
Okay, so that brings us to what was, as you said, the most confusing thing for outsiders: the refusal to make demands. The media went on and on about this. What do you want?
What is your one clear demand?
And Graeber says that question completely missed the point.
It was a profound strategic political refusal. By not making demands, they were refusing to grant legitimacy to the very system they would be making demands of.
They were saying, you're not the ones with the power to fix this. You're the problem.
Precisely. This gets at his distinction between protest and direct action.
Okay, what's the difference?
A protest is an appeal to authority.
Yeah.
You're saying, please, powerful people, change this law for us. You're still accepting their authority.
Direct action is different.
Direct action is acting as if that authority doesn't exist. It's acting as if you're already free. So by occupying the park, setting up a kitchen, a library, a self-governing assembly, they weren't asking for permission. They were just doing it.
Their very existence was the challenge.
Their existence was an act of continuous civil disobedience that rejected the state's right to tell them how and where they could assemble. And the media, the pundits, they saw this as a weakness, as a lack of focus.
But what if they had focused? I mean, what if they'd pushed for something concrete, like a financial transactions tax? Couldn't that have been a tangible win?
That's the classic reformist argument, and it's a valid question. But Graeber's perspective is that movements that focus on small legislative goals often get co-opted and then fizzle out.
The system absorbs them.
It absorbs them, waters down the reform until it's meaningless, and nothing fundamentally changes. He argues that Occupy's power was in its radicalism. Its power was in saying the entire game is rigged, and we refuse to play.
So the goal wasn't to win a small battle, but to change the entire conversation.
To change the playing field. They shifted the problem from, we need a few better policies, to the entire system of financialized government is structurally corrupt. And he argues they wouldn't have had nearly the impact they did if they had just followed the advice of newspaper columnists and tried to work within that broken system.
So that occupation of public space, inspired by what they saw in Egypt and Greece, it wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophical statement.
It was. And it created this fascinating common ground. You had liberals who saw it as classic civil disobedience in the tradition of Thoreau or King breaking an unjust law to highlight a moral principle.
And then you had the anarchists,
who saw it as rejecting the legitimacy of law altogether. But both groups could agree that their actions were justified by a moral order that stands above the state's laws.
which brings up this fundamental contradiction in the modern state that he points to.
The paradox of sovereignty. It's brilliant. Think about it. Where does the U.S. government get its legitimacy?
From the American Revolution.
Which was a massive, illegal, popular uprising, an occupation, if you will. The state's power comes from a past act of illegal rebellion.
So the paradox is that the state now uses its police power to crush the very thing that gave it birth.
Exactly. It suppresses the very mechanism of popular assembly and uprising that, in theory, grants it the right to rule in the first place. Graeber's point is that real constitutional change never comes from the government voluntarily. It doesn't grant freedom.
Freedom has to be taken.
It has to be taken by people acting on moral principles that might be, at the time, illegal. When a community like Zuccotti Park springs up, based on mutual care instead of coercion, it challenges the state's monopoly not just on violence, but on legitimacy itself. It offers a glimpse of another way to be.
Okay, let's shift into a more explicit systems analysis here. Graeber's argument is that this democratic deficit we all feel isn't an accident. It's not a bug. It's a feature.
It is entirely structurally produced. The whole Republican system, propped up by financial power, is designed to manage public participation, not to enable it.
To give the feeling of input without the reality of power.
Precisely. And this is rooted in a very specific and very limited idea of what politics even is. Our system assumes that politics is just a competition between people who have pre-existing interests.
So you come to the voting booth already knowing what you want, and you pick the person who best represents that interest.
Right. There's no room in that model for deliberation. There's no room for people to come together, listen to each other, and maybe change their minds or invent a new solution together.
It's a zero-sum game of competing interests, not a creative process of collective problem-solving.
And if that's your model, the only solutions that ever get considered are the ones that already fit inside the existing box. It systematically weeds out anything truly radical or transformative.
And he says the media plays a huge role in maintaining this box.
A critical role. He argues the job of the mainstream media, especially in a crisis, is to convince the public that everyone else is a moderate, that their angry, radical feelings are an anomaly.
They create the myth of the swing voter.
This mythical centrist who is worried about everything, but not too passionate about anything. And by constantly talking about this person, they make everyone else feel isolated. They suppress radical ideas by making them seem fringe, even if a majority of people secretly hold them. It's a very effective form of ideological control.
So if the system is designed this way, we have to ask the classic question, who benefits? Cui bono?
Graeber is unflinching on this. The beneficiaries are the 1% and the global financial architecture that serves them.
And he says their power rests on two pillars of coercion.
Two pillars. At home, it's the police and the courts, enforcing debts and repossessing property. That's the domestic side. But the global dimension is the one we often miss.
This is where he gets into things like the Bretton Woods system and this concept of seigniorage.
It sounds technical, but it's actually quite simple and devastating. The U.S. dollar is the world's main reserve currency.
Right. Oil, for example, is priced in dollars.
So every other country in the world needs to hold huge reserves of dollars to participate in the global economy. And how do they hold those dollars?
They buy U.S. government debt, treasury bonds.
Exactly. The whole world is effectively forced to lend money to the U.S. government. This incredible advantage, being the country that prints the money everyone else needs, is called seigniorage. It means the U.S. can run up huge deficits that other countries essentially have to finance.
And what is that deficit mostly made of?
War debt. Military spending. So you have this circular system, the world funds America's military, and America's military patrols the globe, ensuring the stability that keeps the dollar on top.
It's an imperial tribute system, just dressed up in the language of finance.
That's precisely what he calls it. And he notes that if you say this in polite company in the U.S., you sound like a paranoid conspiracy theorist.
But anywhere else in the world.
It's just considered obvious. It's a plain reality of how the global system works. The power of Wall Street is inseparable from the power of the Pentagon. It's one unified system of coercion.
So when a movement like Occupy emerges and challenges that system, what's the standard response? It seems like it's less about just crushing them physically and more about crushing their spirit.
It's psychological warfare. He says the number one priority of the powerful is to make protests feel useless, to make the participants walk away feeling defeated and foolish.
He tells that story about the IMF protests in Washington back in 2002.
It's an incredible story. The protesters had a goal: shut down the IMF meetings, and the government brought in such overwhelming security, they locked down the whole city.
So what happened to the meetings?
The meetings were effectively canceled. They had to be held online. So technically, the protesters won. They achieved their goal.
But the government didn't let them feel like they'd won.
Not at all. They made sure the protesters were penned in miles away, that they felt totally ineffective. Graeber says the government decided it was more important to inflict a symbolic defeat on the movement than it was for the IMF to actually hold its meetings.
Wow, that shows you what they're really afraid of. It's not a canceled meeting, it's the idea that collective action can work.
That's the real threat. And this fits into the larger political success of neoliberalism. He points out that economically, it's been pretty mediocre. Global growth was higher in the 50s and 60s.
But politically,
Politically, it has been a spectacular success. It has convinced a huge portion of the world that this specific form of hyper-financialized capitalism is the only possible system. There is no alternative.
and to achieve that, he says, required a relentless campaign against the human imagination.
A beautiful and terrifying phrase. A campaign to convince us that the only place for freedom and creativity is in what you buy or what you do online. Not in the public sphere, not in collective action.
So when Occupy created a real-world, non-commercial, democratic space, it was a direct assault on that campaign.
A direct assault. And the system's response was swift and coordinated. The fact that all the major Occupy camps across the country were evicted within a few days of each other in November 2011.
That was no coincidence.
That was a federally coordinated crackdown. And the media narrative that accompanied it was key to the delegitimization strategy.
Right. Suddenly all the stories were about sanitation problems, sexual assaults, violent anarchists.
The goal was to paint the camps as dangerous, chaotic places that needed police intervention to protect the activists from themselves. It was a way to destroy the movement's moral authority.
And the ultimate betrayal, in Graeber's view, came from the liberal establishment.
Yes, he talks about this tacit bargain that exists between radicals and liberals. The radicals push the boundaries of what's possible, which creates political space for the liberals to come in and enact reforms.
And in return, the liberals are supposed to protect the radicals' basic civil liberties.
The radicals stay out of jail, basically. But when the police moved in on OWS, the liberal establishment just looked the other way. They got the shift in the national conversation that they wanted, and then they abandoned the people who made it happen. For the organizers, that was the final proof that the whole system, including its liberal wing, was a dead end.
Okay, so let's bring this into the present. The camps were cleared, but the issues didn't go away. The energy didn't just vanish.
Not at all. In a way, Occupy was so successful because the political order had already delegitimized itself. Remember, congressional approval ratings were already in the single digits before Occupy. The public was already there. The activists just gave that anger a name and a place.
And the economic precarity, the debt machine, that's only gotten worse.
It's deepened. The extraction continues. You see it with the working poor, trapped in payday loans with 300% interest rates. You see it with graduates who have mortgage-sized student loans for jobs that don't pay enough.
He makes this really stunning point about who we're actually paying.
It's staggering. He says that for many, many Americans in those situations, they are now paying more of their income directly to Wall Street in the form of interest and fees than they pay to the government in taxes.
Think about that. The primary extractor of wealth from your labor isn't the IRS anymore, it's the financial industry.
Which is why the idea of a debt jubilee, debt cancellation, has been such a powerful revolutionary demand throughout all of human history. It strikes at the heart of the modern extraction machine.
So how did the movement's ethos survive after the evictions?
It shifted tactics. It went from a centralized, highly visible occupation to a decentralized local network of mutual aid and direct action.
So things like
Occupying foreclosed homes to stop evictions, organizing rent strikes, creating debtors' assemblies where people could collectively strategize about how to deal with their debt. It became less about spectacle and more about building resilient local alternatives.
which brings us to this bigger strategic concept of dual power.
Dual power is the idea that you don't wait for revolution to happen someday. You start building the institutions of a new society right now, alongside the old corrupt ones.
You create liberated spaces.
Liberated spaces, alternative institutions, neighborhood assemblies, worker-run co-ops, mutual aid networks. You build a parallel power structure that over time gains more legitimacy in the eyes of the people than the official state does.
And Graeber points to a really powerful real-world example where this actually worked.
Argentina in the early 2000s. It's an incredible story. After their economy completely collapsed in 2001, there was a massive popular uprising.
And they had that famous slogan,
Que se vayan todos. They all
Uh-huh.
must go. It was a total rejection of the entire political class.
So what did they do instead?
They built their own systems. Neighborhood assemblies started making local decisions. Workers took over bankrupt factories and started running them themselves as collectives. The fabricas were recuperadas. They created their own currencies. They built a massive dual power structure born out of necessity.
And this put immense pressure on the official government.
Immense. The political class had zero legitimacy. So when a new government came in, led by Nestor Kirchner, they had to do something truly radical to win back any public trust.
And what was that?
They defaulted on a huge portion of their international debt to the IMF and other institutions, an act that was considered unthinkable.
And they could only do it because the people had so thoroughly delegitimized the old way of doing things.
It's exactly. The domestic popular uprising gave the government the political cover to defy the global financial powers. It was a huge victory, not just for Argentina, but for the entire global South. And it all started with a movement that successfully delegitimized its own ruling class. It shows what's possible.
When we place this book within our broader themes here at Crisis and Perception, it just clicks on so many levels.
It really does. First, there's the theme of systems versus symbolic participation.
The idea that voting can be a symbol that masks the real system.
Precisely. Graeber shows how these carefully managed elections give us the feeling of control, while the real decisions about our lives are made elsewhere, in the realms of finance and military power. The symbol of participation hides the lack of actual power.
Then there's the theme of power disguised as procedure.
Yes, we see that on both sides. The U.S. Constitution is a set of procedures designed to limit popular power. But the consensus process of OWS is also a procedure, one designed to maximize it.
So procedure is never neutral.
Never. The question you always have to ask is, who does this procedure empower? Does it enable equals to deliberate, or does it manage an outcome to protect the powerful? The rules of the game determine who wins.
And finally, he just blows up the branding of democracy.
He completely does. He takes it away from being this precious artifact of Western civilization that was invented in Athens and then gifted to the rest of the world.
And shows it as something else entirely.
As a fundamental human capacity, the ability of people to come together and solve their own problems without a boss. It's something that has been reinvented thousands of times in thousands of places whenever people find themselves free from coercion. It's not a thing you have, it's a thing you do.
So as we wrap up, what's the core achievement of this book? What does it help us see differently?
I think it does two things perfectly. It correctly identifies the problem, this fusion of state and financial power into what he calls mafia capitalism, and it proposes a solution. And that solution isn't a violent overthrow.
It's the patient work of building a genuinely democratic culture through practice.
It's about challenging the organizing principle of public life, which he says has become bribery. Whether you call it lobbying or campaign donations, the system runs on the assumption that money is what grants you a voice.
And he says the deep frustration so many of us feel comes from being trapped in that system.
It does. You're forced to spend your life chasing money, often through debt, just to get the power to do something else, to have the time to pursue something meaningful for yourself or your community.
And the experience of the camps, he says, showed an alternative.
It was a direct challenge to that cynicism, creating a community based on mutual care and solidarity. Without money being the mediator, it proves that another world is possible. He says the revolutionary urge at its core is just an indignation that politics is only about self-interest. It's a demand for something more.
It's a demand for a democratic imagination, a willingness to challenge our most deeply held assumptions about what's possible.
And he connects this to the biggest crises we face. He says the debt crisis and the ecological crisis are basically the same problem. Both are based on a promise of impossible future growth. Debt is a promise to produce more in the future to pay it back. And our economic system promises infinite growth on a finite planet. Both are promises that can't be kept.
So if the problem is linked, maybe the solution is too. This brings us to his final provocative thought for us to chew on.
It's a beautiful, radical proposal, he asks. What if we combine a planetary debt cancellation, a great jubilee, wiping the slate clean with a massive reduction in work?
Like a 4-hour workday or a 5-month guaranteed vacation for everyone.
And the point isn't just leisure. The point is to free up the human time and energy and imagination that is currently consumed by debt and overwork. To create the space we would actually need to practice self-governance, to solve our collective problems, to build that democratic culture. That, he suggests, is what a real revolution might look like.
We've been diving into The Democracy Project, a history, a crisis, a movement by David Graeber. We encourage you to read the book yourself or borrow it from a library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.